What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another solo leveling Arise video. All right, guys, we're going to talk about crit and crit damage conceptually this time. All right, we're going to talk about the purpose of overcrit and how crit damage works currently and why you are going to need to do everything you can to get as much crit rate as you can to a certain point depending on the monster's level. We're going to talk all about it. We're going to show you guys some stats and we're going to show you guys unofficial testing results right now. Okay, just so everyone is aware, for crit rate right now the testing is still going on. Anything can happen. We do know overcrit does exist. We do know its importance, but we don't know what the actual numbers are yet for the mobs, so that is more to come. So shout out to the testing team on that one. Crit damage, we have more of a solidified number. I'll give you guys the numbers in a different video, but I will give you the concept and why and how crit damage works based on how the game has set it up. Now remember, a couple things to note about here. The main thing to remember is the crit damage and crit rate numbers are going to change based on, and the percentages are going to change based on your level versus the level of the monster. So that's where it's going to differ quite a bit. So while this is finishing up here, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and use SJW, and we're going to do a couple alterations to crit, and we're going to explain to you guys why now crit damage and overcrit matter so much. Okay, now in the past this wasn't as big of an issue because we never had these problems, right? Because mobs were lower levels, we had different sets of gear. Now the mobs are much higher level. It's a lot more difficult now to find a mob to beat at a higher level and have the same crit rate that's shown on your stat sheet. So let's just show you a quick example of this. Now before I do this part, I do need to go in and buy a key. Let me see if hopefully I have enough to buy a key. And show you guys how the monster's level works and how it differs. Okay, perfect. We do have enough one. There we go. One key right there. Okay, so go to SJW. Now you guys can see a couple different things. All right, so if you go to the stat sheet here, and I've already shown you this, you can read off exactly what it says, right? If you click on any of these things, this also applies to precision, by the way, just so you guys are aware. But crit hit rate, for example, the chance to inflict critical hit damage, the required stat value increases depending on the target's level. Now, this is very important. Now, this should kind of read a little differently. The required stat value should, you should increase the stat value depending on the target's level. I think that's what it should really say. Now, to get 50%, you only need 4,200 some odd. Right? That's the 50% cap. Now, that 50% cap will only apply usually for any monsters below you, and that 50% will actually, for the most part, work. Right? You'll notice the 50% for the most part will apply. It may have a variation of like 46% sometimes, maybe sometimes even higher, but nonetheless, the number will always maintain to some degree to that amount. Okay? Okay, and now this right here should put me at about there, 4,872. Okay, so this we're getting close to the bare minimum that we need to get. So this one we're gonna take, actually we need to take curse off as well, so I can take this one off, and let's just put in like blessing or something. I don't know. Let's find blessing one. There, we'll do this blessing. Okay, this one doesn't have crit rate. So let's just say 4,800. Now remember, it's 4,200-ish, I think, to get yourself to the 50% mark. But you guys can see 567, 242. Now remember, this will of course affect everything that I do. Now the only things to remember about crit is that the stat sheet will change based on the monster's levels, but passives will not. So if you use Igris, for example, this 8% is always going to be 8%. It doesn't matter what the mob's level is, that 8% is always going to be important and it's going to always be there. So that's why it's so useful to have passives that give you crit, because they won't be affected. Okay, now for skills, same thing applies here, right? If you have a skill that gives you crit damage up or crit rate up even, those again, like this crit damage one here, 80% is actually 80%. For example, this one here with Sunder won't be affected by this. That 10% will be 10%. If you have the elite one or the legendary one, it'll be whatever the legendary one is. Okay, so for example, this is a skill that will increase your crit hit rate and will actually give you that full amount. So I've gone ahead and removed Plum Sword. This is where we're at, 383, 506. This is a level 60 mob. I'm a level 98 character, almost level 99, right? And I'm in the blue. So we have 50% stats. You guys can see again, the stats has not changed, right? We're at 4.8k. So we're going to show you the 50% and how it applies here. And then we're going to jump into a high level mob and then try a higher level mob and show you guys how that 4.8k no longer does that 50%. Now we remove Plum Sword clearly because Plum Sword gives you crit and crit damage, and we don't want that extra disturbance. So this is how you're going to do this test. We're just going to use the DKD. We're going to use the golden tail fox plum, or spear, doesn't really affect it, right? But watch, we're going to go ahead and let this guy do his thing, and then we're going to jump in here, and again, we're in the blue, so our stats are increased and modified, but you guys can see majority of the time we will definitely be doing 50% against a mob that is lower level or than us, and you guys will notice that majority of my hits will in fact be crit. Now, if you add Igris into this, and if you add any other maneuver that gives you more crit, you'll continue doing the crit. Look at this. This is almost like 100% almost at this point, because we are in fact in the blue, and this mob is just taking it up the booty. Poor bears, man. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear, right? You guys see that. Now, let's take that same concept, leave it at the same stats, and go over to a mob that's higher level, right? Let's just go to a mob. You guys saw how many times I crit there, right? Fairly often. Let's just go to a mob that's, let's say level 98. Hey, perfect. Same level mob. We're gonna go ahead and get us back in the regular CP here. 925, perfect. So 925, 916, right there. We're not going to add any more shadows. We're not going to increase it any further. This is the same level mob now with 4.8k, right? 50% crit. Now, after this, we're going to go ahead and take this into a mob that's level 109. So that's a POS 20 mob, and see if that same amount of crits will apply. All right, so again, no plum sword or anything to disturb us here. So let's go ahead and just basic attacks. Basic attacks. You guys can see already the amount of basic attacks are a lot more likely to do non-crits, right? Look at this. You guys can see this is more true to the 50% mark than the last one was. Probably even lower, to be honest. So you guys can see again, look at this. The difference between the bear and being in the blue versus white CP and being a higher level mob, right? Again, a little more true to the 50%, I would say, right? Maybe even less. I'd say maybe even 45, 40-ish%. If we were to do all the calculation of the hits, I'd say it's pretty close, right? Okay, so let's take that same number now, okay, and go to a level 109 mob. And we'll do the same thing with crit damage, all right? We're going to show you guys how crit damage scales and how it works. Now remember, for crit hit rate, guys, this is all conceptual right now. Things could change. We don't have definitive numbers. Shout out to Burr and the testing team that's been doing heavy lifting on this. And there's a lot to look into for this to work the way it's supposed to work. And we don't have the exact numbers just yet. But let's go out over here and go to a level 20, 106, 101. We'll probably be a little higher now. The crits should be a little bit higher based on combat power. Now that we're in the recommended and a little bit above, that number will still be a little bit higher. Now, if you were to take OVERCRIT and add that in there, you'll see much better results with more OVERCRIT, right? Look, numbers are looking a little better, right? But still, I'd say roughly about a little lower than 50%, right? I mean, if we were to do a full calculation, I'm seeing quite a bit of crits, but also a lot right there. You guys saw a whole series of non-crits right there, right? Okay, now let's go back and test this, right? Now you can see a lot of those are crits, right? But then a lot of them are also non-crits. Now let's go ahead and take this mob and raise our crit now. We'll triple it, maybe double it, okay? This should put me over, there's 12.5, okay, 12.5. Now this is OVERCRIT and a half. I don't think you need this much to show what I'm showing. I try to keep it around 10k. Again, there's no definitive number, but we do know overcritting does exist. And shout out to Mouse who showed it on his video. And the testing team will figure this out. But you guys will see now, I'll be critting fairly often at 50% now. What the true number is at 50%, right? Before, probably a little lower. This time, for sure, we're getting way more crits. And you guys can see that a lot of them are happening. Look at that. Way more crits are coming through this time. Right? You guys can definitely see more crits. I mean, I know I can. If you guys can't, let me know, but I'm definitely seeing a lot more crits. So overcritting is in fact a real thing. It does exist. It is in fact built into the game, and they explain it very poorly how it works. But right now we're working on getting those numbers and trying to figure it out. Okay, so there you guys go. Definitely is a thing, and definitely does work much better with higher level mobs when you have more crit versus just being at the cap. All right, so there you guys go. So that is essentially crit and how it works. Again, in my personal taste, I'm keeping it at, depending on the mob you're fighting, right? I range anywhere between 8.5k crit all the way up to 10k crit. That's my overcrit for that. Okay, now let's talk about crit damage and how it works. Alright guys, now for crit damage, I'm not going to go over the actual gameplay. We're going to show you guys some numbers because we've done a lot of testing to show you guys how this works. So first off, shout out to Burr, ISU64, and everybody else who's part of this testing, Mouse, myself, Holy Hells, etc. So here is the actual formula that was figured out on how to get your percentage. So it's combat stat, which is, or sorry, your crit damage stat, which is right over here. In my case, it's 17982 on this setup that I have. And then you plug it in here, you go plus 1000 divided by 0.4 times crit damage stat again, plus 2000 equals stat page crit damage. So this is how you get it. If you do this, you enter in your stats, you'll get exactly what you need. Now this is important because this is how we formulate the numbers in the spreadsheet. So we're going to show you guys how the spreadsheet turned out and what the numbers were. Now remember, the higher the level the mob, the lower your crit damage will look in the formula. Okay, so again, this was my numbers. I did this testing right here, I believe, up to a certain point. So 30371 was the stat I had on my pay to win. That was actually 221.73% on the formula page. So if you look at the formula page here, if I were to click here, this number would have been 221.73. Now, if we did the numbers, right? We did a lot of these numbers actually, but we only needed one instance at the end of the day. One non-crit and one crit. So these were the two numbers right there. Non-crit and crit. When you effectively put it into the formula and actually see what the results were, you guys can see here it was 127.42%. The real number was 124.86 when you put it into the formula. So this was actually what the crit damage was. That's right, it's not 221% like it shows on the stat page because the monster level is higher than us. Now let's look at something a little bit different, right? As you go down to 105, you guys can see the number goes up just a tad bit, even because the monster's level is a little bit lower. Remember, this is at 99% precision, and we did many tests on this to make sure it works. So the monster level did change a little bit. Now let's look at level 99. The number here is 21465, right? And you guys can see with that number, after putting in the formula, it's 121.8, even though it says 212.21 there. Okay, so roughly about little over half. Now if you look over here now, 96, because it's the same number here, let's see, what was the number here? 21465, 21, close enough here, right? Very similar. Right, but as you went up a little bit, 24341, so 24341, there's 126%, right? Now go to level 90 mob, 20171, 129. So you guys can see here, consistently dropping the amount every single time based on the monster's level. Now the higher you go though, or the lower the level monster, the closer it is to the result. So 216 versus 157, level 70 mob 187 versus 213, level 60 mob 204 versus 212. So you guys can see the lower the level the mob, the more real the number looks on your stat page. But the moment you start going up in the mob level, that number starts to decrease based on the formula. And this is what we've noticed, right? Every single time. You guys simply do this and check it yourselves, right? There's not much of a difference here between the variables of the formula versus what we actually have here, but it definitely shows you guys 216%, you do this and this, you're not getting anywhere near 216%, right? So same with this one, right? You have 210%, you go down to 126. So what we've noticed is it definitely does scale lower based on the mob's level, right? If you go to like level 109 and find the 227%, look at this, it's down to 120, right? 213 is 120. So this is how it's done, and this is why it's so important, guys, to remember that this stat page doesn't always reflect what you're getting in the game, because this description right here, the required stat value increase depending on the target's level, does in fact mean that this stat is not going to be accurate based on the mob's level. So I hope this kind of helps you guys out to understand why you need to increase your stats. The OVERCRIT one especially is super important. This one here, we have actual data. If you are looking for the data, I can of course share it if the testing team allows me. And I hope this kind of give you guys some insight in terms of what's happening on the back end of the game, so you understand how it happens on the front end. So in regards to crit damage, guys, ideally you want to hit about 200% crit damage, and then from there the other stats start to matter a little bit more, right? So 200, 210, I mean, it's up to you really at the end of the day where you want to go with crit damage. You guys can see how drastically it drops when you're fighting higher level mobs. This applies to pretty much the entire WOBL, etc., right? Anywhere that you use it, but it is still one of the best multipliers. But after a certain point, you definitely want to focus on defense pen, getting it to 20%, getting damage increase to 20% when you can. So you ideally want to go 200%, 210%, and then 20/20 here, and that should round out what you're looking for in terms of its most effectiveness. After that, it starts to really taper off in terms of its effectiveness, and you guys can see that in the spreadsheet, of course, right? Because the higher level you are, like 127 versus 123 versus 120 versus 117, right? So I mean, like, its effectiveness does start to drop quite a bit when you start hitting the 200 plus percentages versus when the 104 versus like over here like 186, right? It's a much higher amount. And then as you can see here, now it starts to go from the 200% up to 209. It's only a 5% increase, 3% increase, 3% increase, 4% increase, right? So that's why it's important to make sure you kind of do focus on other stats outside of crit damage, and it does taper off based on the formula that we see, and obviously from the testing that we've shown. All right, guys, this is Payne. Thank you so much for watching. Again, shout out to Burr and the rest of the testing team. Much love to you guys. Much love to Ice264 taking the time to kind of walk me through this again, because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I hope this kind of does open your eyes in terms of why crit and crit damage, how it works, and why overcrit is so important, plus where you should focus on after a certain point of hitting crit damage. All right, guys, see you guys in the next one. Take care.